Hello. Thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Rocky James. I'm Coast Salish. I'm from the Penelica tribes. I'm here today with my colleagues, Dr. Daniel Heath Justice and William White. Presentation's a little bit different from all the other epidemiological work and empirical based work. We're more oral history oriented, and so I'm going to go first, and I'm going to talk about the institutional impacts of colonization on the mental health of Indigenous, gay, bisexual, and transgender men. I would like to thank you all for helping me advocate for the health of Indigenous, gay, bisexual, and transgender men. I see it as an effort to work with each other to decolonize the way we think about health, the way we speak about health, and how we treat each other. And the way I kind of see my portion of the presentation is as a gradual discussion with the Health Summit. Last year at the Health Summit, I started to speak and identify fear-based learning in First Nations communities as a result of attending Indian residential schools. This was done for the completion of my master's degree in Studies in Policy and Practice through the University of Victoria. And I was very interested in getting into the policy cycle, but what has turned out is that my work is more about identifying barriers to policy development, barriers about why policies are not being implemented, and barriers about why there is failure to meet criteria established in policies. So essentially what came out of the research was the concept of fear-based learning, and that the nature of oppression occurred through targeting the sexuality of children who lacked the intellectual and emotional capacity to understand what was happening to them, their brothers and sisters, and their identity as people at Indian residential schools. It occurred in the relationship between students and Indian residential school administrators, priests, nuns, and support staff. Physical, emotional, and sexual abuse also occurred between students, something identified as student-on-student abuse. It was common in Indian residential schools throughout the country that there was a 60% mortality rate for students attending an Indian residential school. Children who did not die in school because of sexual abuse, malnutrition, or murder were not provided with emotional tools to resolve multiple traumatic experiences. We're looking at here is a process used and developed by the Adjudication Secretariat, the organization responsible for overseeing the independent assessment process within the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. Indian residential school survivors each received $10,000 for attending their first year of Indian residential school. For each following year, they received an additional $1,000. That was to acknowledge all the common experiences that students experience, like strap-ins, loss of language, and disconnection from families and home. The independent assessment process is to examine more extreme cases of physical and sexual abuse. There are 5 levels to measure the sexual abuse experienced by Indian residential school survivors. As the levels move from 1 to 5, the frequency and severity of abuse intensifies. As of July 31st, 2012, we know that this way of reality was common for 41,130 children, and that there is an upward of 11,000 claims in progress currently. This is a unique occurrence of genocide because it spanned more than 1 century and through several generations of different families throughout Canada. Indian residential schools call this the point system. Sexual abuse level 3 is something that's probably the most common experience of Indian residential school survivors. One or more incidences of oral intercourse, one or more incidents of digital vaginal penetration, one or more incidents of attempted anal vaginal penetration, excluded attempted digital penetration, repeated persistent incidences of masturbation. In sexual abuse level 5, we have repeated persistent incidences of anal or vaginal intercourse, repeated persistent incidents of anal vaginal penetration with an object. Most of the time the object was a religious object like a crucifix. In these types of situations, children were told something like, if you tell anybody, your entire family will go to hell, or nobody will believe you. Unfortunately, when children would tell their parents would say, stop lying, they're religious people. They'd never do that. There were 3 different ways commonly that Indian residential school survivors dealt with the abuse. Fully self-actualized survivors who resisted oppression and initiated personal, community, and national reconciliation efforts. Partially self-actualized survivors who, after decades of keeping their abuse secret, have just initiated reconciliation. The most vulnerable members are survivors who refuse to reach out for help. Some fully self-actualized children would group together and beat up a predator during their residence at an Indian residential school. Partially self-actualized children waited for the independent assessment process to share their stories. Some of the more vulnerable survivors wouldn't even tell their immediate family members that they were going through this process. They tell their family they're going grocery shopping or have a medical appointment that they need to attend for the day. The most vulnerable members would rather die than share their truth. These are usually survivors found in the downtown east side. To understand how the extreme physical and sexual abuse affected children, they use harm levels. The harm levels go from 1 to 5 as well. Harm level 1 being the most modest detrimental impact, evidenced by occasional short-term one of anxiety, nightmares, bedwetting, aggression, panic states, hypervigilance, retaliatory rage, depression, humiliation, and loss of self-esteem. Each survivor that enters the independent assessment process is compensated for these impacts, which means that 41,130 people have lived with this trauma. In harm level 3, we see a continued detrimental impact, evidenced by difficulties with interpersonal relationships, occasional obsessive compulsive and panic states, some post-traumatic stress disorder, occasional sexual dysfunction, addiction to drugs, alcohol, or substances, a long-term significantly disabling physical injury resulting from a defined sexual assault, or lasting and significant anxiety, guilt, self-blame, lack of trust in others, nightmares, bedwetting, aggression, hypervigilance, anger, retaliatory rage, and possibly self-inflicted injury. Hypervigilance has the longest lasting effect on survivors because survivors are constantly scanning their environment for danger. If you have 2 or more survivors in one family and more than 2 families on a reserve who live with hypervigilance, it tends to reduce the possibility of achieving maximum emotional, spiritual, physical, and mental health. People can attend the BC Truth and Reconciliation event in Vancouver during September 2013, and you'll hear this reality for yourselves. That was also my main reason for wanting to be at this health summit, is to encourage different representatives from organizations or population at large to attend the BC Truth and Reconciliation event next September. We have elders in our organization that are working very hard to coordinate a 50,000 people march for the first day of the event. It will be 2 or 3 days long. In harm level 5, the most severe level, continued harm resulting in serious dysfunction, evidenced by psychotic disorganization, loss of ego boundaries, personality disorders, pregnancy resulting from a defined sexual assault, or the forced termination of such pregnancy, or being required to place for adoption a child resulting therefrom. Self-injury, suicidal tendencies, inability to form or maintain personal relationships, chronic post-traumatic states, sexual dysfunction, or eating disorders. The forced termination of pregnancy is a part of the oral history in my family. There are 2 mass graves located near where the Indian residential school was located on Penelakut Island. There were forced abortions. Children died trying to swim away from the island, or were regularly murdered by being pushed out a window when they wouldn't do what they were told. These experiences are what Indian residential school survivors are referring to when they say we have no parenting skills. And how could they when they were being sexually abused, physically abused, malnourished, living in fear of being murdered, and sleep deprived in a foreign environment? Because children were told no one will ever believe you, children that grew up to be parents never told their children or grandchildren. Generations of families grew up wondering why their parents would fly into fits of rage, depression, and suicide attempts. Failure to reconcile this history following generations experience the same rage, depression, and high suicide rates, but never understand why. This results in what is called a family tree of lateral violence. Residential schools are not something that happened 2 centuries ago and stopped. The last one closed in Saskatchewan in 1996. Because no one will believe you was and still is a social norm. Violence transformed from something white people did to First Nations people, doing it to each other. An example from the previous year, we have Nora Bernard, who is one of the most well-respected First Nations women in Canada. She was responsible for leading First Nations people into the independent assessment process. Being a survivor of the Shubenacadie school herself, or what survivors refer to as Shubi. In December 2007, she was stabbed to death by her grandson, who was later convicted of manslaughter. A reality for the West Coast here is that there is an increase in re-victimization as a result of the IAP process. In the reserve I'm from, a 63-year-old elder hung himself the day before his hearing for residential school compensation. The news reported that Penelakut elder committed suicide day he was to recount residential school experiences for settlement payout. In the same region on the central Vancouver Island area, also known as Coast Salish Territory, several months ago, leaders within the Cowichan tribe declared a state of emergency. The alert came after an alarming spike in numbers of suicides and suicide attempts. Between January and May of this year, 52 suicide alerts within the large BC First Nation resulted in 4 members taking their own lives. Even after the cry for help went out to all levels of government, 7 more suicide attempts have taken place. And speaking with an elder recently, she had shared with me that when the youth don't know, the people around them are not talking, so they are kept in the dark. The education system doesn't teach what happened, so the youth are dealing with things that they don't know affect them. Education demystifies what happened. This is the intergenerational impact. People commit suicide because they feel like they can't cope with it. There are continued acts of colonization in Coast Salish territory. An example that is continuing to this day is the issue around the Susna'am traditional burial site near Musqueam. This has been going on for several months, and it really is a failure to see eye to eye with First Nations people. As much progress as we feel like we're making within our education system with the treaty process and with the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, there are still other factors that impact how First Nations people see the relationship with non-First Nations people. And so a lot of what people feel the injustice is how can one First Nations burial site be different from a non-First Nations burial site? So as I said at the beginning of my presentation, my work, for whatever reason the Creator sees fit, has not been about the policy cycle. It has been about identifying barriers to why policies are not effective. I first became aware of the idea about 10 years ago when I was working for my band office and was volunteering with the Economic Development Department. Why the same economic development plan had been on the table since 1989 and nothing had ever came out of that plan. Nothing ever materialized because there was always conflict between different families. And so as I've kind of gone along in my journey, I've seen the same kind of barriers to healthy communities and healthy policy development, seen especially through the independent assessment process why First Nations people are so resistant to intervention from outside organizations, people from outside the community, because people are dealing with their Indian residential school experience, the family tree of their Indian residential school experience, lateral violence that they inflict on each other. And it feels kind of overwhelming to be here today and hear gay people talking about the same thing: lack of resources, lack of funding, lack of support from the government. I see this in so many of the different communities that I come from, not just First Nations and not just queer. So it just kind of results in a failure to change health inequities that Indigenous, gay, bisexual, and transgender men suffer from. So that's kind of my portion. And we'll turn it now over to my colleague, Dr. Daniel Heath Justice from the University of British Columbia. Thank you.